Revenge with Karen.
The photo was taken on a throwaway Polaroid mid-laugh, with a crooked horizon and beer stains on the corner. 5 people sat on mismatched porch chairs, huddled under a tarp stapled to the cabin wall like it was a lean-to. Karen stood off to the side, holding the camera, too tired to join the toast, but too proud to leave the moment undocumented. That was July 2014, the real beginning. Before HR manuals, before Series B funding, before Chase decided his smoothie cleanse gave him clarity of vision. The founder had rented the rundown lake house on a favor and handed everyone Sharpies and blank paper, saying, "We're writing our own damn rules." Back then, Karen printed server labels by hand, typed contracts in Courier because the old printer jammed on anything fancy. She sat beside him, actual desk beside desk. The founder cussed out a VC on speakerphone and high-fived her afterward like they'd just robbed a bank. That office had duct tape on the HVAC and a sticky note over the thermostat reading "Do not touch." Karen will know. Every time someone got laid off in those early years, Karen was the one who stayed late to clear their desk and quietly box up their dignity. She was the one who remembered birthdays, allergies, who took sugar in their coffee even when no one asked anymore. Her job title didn't change much, but the company did. By 2020, the floors had marble inlays and a kombucha tap in the kitchen. Karen's old cubicle had been gutted to make room for a wellness nook, which was mostly a velvet bean bag and a Himalayan salt lamp no one dusted. She'd been moved near the emergency exit, as if they were trying to tell her something subliminal. New hires wore all birds and blinked twice when she mentioned the names of people who built the platform they now treated like holy scripture. Once, she said something about Tina's code comments being pure gold, and one guy blinked and asked, "Who's Tina?" Tina, who worked 80-hour weeks while 6 months pregnant and cried in the server closet when the login servers collapsed. Tina, who no longer worked there. Karen just smiled and said, "Never mind. It's funny how loyalty ages you. Not like time, but like sediment. You build up in layers, trust, hours, memory, secrets, and then one day, someone calls you legacy ops like it's a mold strain they found in the basement. But Karen had something they didn't. She'd been the keeper of the chaos. She knew what was buried beneath the sleek slide decks and inflated valuations. She knew where the early contracts lived, the gentleman's understandings that weren't in the cloud. She knew, deep in her bones, this house was built on things Chase had never earned and would never understand. And hey, since you're here with me this far, and clearly not Chase's cousin from Dartmouth, maybe hit that subscribe button and give it a like. It keeps the lights on and gives the team a reason to keep digging up the good stories. You'd be shocked how many start with a Polaroid and end in a boardroom. Now, back to the silence. Not the dramatic kind, the slow kind, quiet exile of experience. Karen was being left behind, and she knew it. First came the meeting removals, her calendar going oddly empty, the invites mysteriously rescinded. Then came the audits, as if they were prepping to blame her for something not yet decided. And finally, the whispered transition plan, as though she'd misplaced her own relevance somewhere near the breakroom fridge. Still, she stayed late. Filed paperwork, smiled politely while being excluded from brainstorms. When the founder fell ill, she was the only one who visited outside of Slack. When he died, she kept the message short and sent flowers, because grief wasn't a performance for her. It wasn't until she saw Chase, new CEO, hair gelled into a smirk, confidence curled like smoke, start to reference his vision that she felt it. That final dislocation, as if she'd stayed too long at a party where the music changed and no one noticed she hadn't danced in years. But she kept showing up, because someone had to remember. Someone had to hold the memory of where it all began. And someone had to keep that Polaroid safe. The founder's retirement email landed in everyone's inbox at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. No fanfare. No scheduled town hall. Just a plain text message signed warmly, M. You read between the lines, past the thanks, and the vague references to family health and next chapters, you could hear the Roman IV drip. Karen had already known. She was the one who drove him home from chemo. She knew how tired he'd gotten, knew how his hands shook when he tried to sign payroll checks, so she started pre-filling them. What she didn't know, what slapped her like a tax audit to the soul, was who he left it all to. Chase. Not chairman. Not interim. Just Chase. He didn't even update the signature on his company-wide emails. Still signed them with C, as if he were texting his club promoter. First order of business. Flatten the hierarchy. Which, translated from MBAEs, meant gut operations, cut compliance, and make room for his frat brothers with glossy resumes and startup vocabularies, so dense they made common sense feel like a foreign language. Karen watched it unfold like a slow-motion car wreck, where she was still technically in the passenger seat. First, her standing Monday sync disappeared, restructured. Then her access to the shared financials got revoked, privacy concerns. She asked politely. The reply came from someone named Trent, who CC'd another Chase hire named Griffin. She'd never met them in person, but their email signatures had emojis and quotes like "innovation is just rebellion in a tie." Griffin replied, "Hey Karen." Looping in Chase, he'll circle back. He never did. By week 3, Chase had taken over the founder's glass office. The blinds were always drawn. The rug had been swapped out for something expensive and joyless. Karen peeked in once and saw a ring light and a whiteboard with Q4 vibes, scrawled in neon marker. Someone had mounted a 90-inch screen on the wall, playing a loop of the company's launch video, with the founder edited out. It was a company-wide vision session hosted by Chase and his inner circle, during which Karen was parked in the back row between 2 interns who kept referring to the company as a platform for dynamic disruption. One of them leaned over and whispered, "Are you, like, legacy ops or something?" Karen didn't answer. She just stared at the screen where her own handwriting, yes, hers, labeled an old warehouse server in a photo now being used as a joke. Chase laughed. Interns laughed louder. They were building something, not a business, a brand. And loyalty, she realized, wasn't part of the aesthetic. Karen still had her badge, still had her title. But Chase had made it clear she was now a relic, something to be quietly admired from afar, not consulted. Her voice no longer mattered. In one meeting, she brought up a systems redundancy issue with a vendor they'd used for 7 years. Chase interrupted her with a grin and said, "Thanks, Karen. We've got it covered. Let's let the new team breathe a little, yeah?" He said it like she was a smothering aunt who'd overstayed her welcome at Thanksgiving. In another meeting, she wasn't invited, but she walked by. The door was cracked just enough to hear Chase say, "She's got founder residue. It's like emotional mold, hard to scrub off." The room chuckled, so she scrubbed. Her calendar, her inbox, her hope. Every day, she still showed up at 7:45, still made the rounds, still caught the things the spreadsheets missed, still left notes for facilities when she saw the elevator acting up. She didn't complain, not yet, because for all his ego and buzzwords, Chase was still his father's son. And somewhere deep under the layers of cologne and ego, maybe there was a flicker of decency waiting to be coaxed out. Maybe loyalty still had a chance. But something darker had settled in her chest, like a filing cabinet she wasn't ready to open. Not yet. She didn't know it yet, but Chase had already made up his mind. She was a problem he thought he'd solved soon. "Karen, don't make waves. He's looking for a reason." The words came from Ron in legal, of all people. Ron, who once got blackout drunk at an offsite and cried about how Karen was the only reason the place hadn't burned down in 2016. Now he was whispering to her in the hallway like they were planning a prison escape. His eyes darted toward the glass conference room where Chase was laughing with 2 of his freshly minted lieutenants, probably about synergy or crypto. Ron looked miserable. His tie was crooked, and he'd stopped bringing his homemade lentil soup, opting for vending machine jerky like the rest of the morale-decayed herd. "I'm telling you," he muttered, "he wants to purge the old guard. Just needs a headline to do it." Karen didn't answer, just nodded like she was agreeing to lunch plans she'd never accept. The headline came knocking 2 days later. One of Chase's hires, she thought his name was Zeke or maybe Zach, accidentally sent a vendor contract to the wrong partner. Not a small one either. The file included discount structures, early termination clauses, a spreadsheet that very clearly exposed how they were playing 2 partners against each other. Karen found out when an old contact from the vendor side emailed her directly with, "This seems off. Are you guys okay over there?" Karen read it twice, then read the forwarded message trail, then sat back and stared at the ceiling tiles like they might offer divine guidance. It was a rookie mistake, an expensive one, and Chase's crew handled it like it was a game of dodgeball. Zach, or Zeke, immediately blamed email caching. Griffin said it was a procedural hiccup. And Chase, he just grinned and said, "Let's keep moving forward. No need to dwell." Karen nearly choked. That hiccup could tank the partnership. They'd used that vendor for years. There were NDAs layered on top of handshake deals layered on top of favors. Karen had brokered half of them personally, usually over lukewarm coffee and a shared hatred of buzzwords. Now it was unraveling because someone wanted to look efficient on Slack. She drafted an email, titled Urgent Misrouting of Partner Document. It was short, clinical, factual. No emotion, no blame, just facts and a suggested course correction. She hovered over send, then heard Ron's voice again. He's looking for a reason. Her finger trembled. She deleted the draft. Instead, she scheduled a meeting with one of the partner account managers. Informal, off the record. Just checking in, she said, sipping burnt coffee like it was her dignity leaking from a styrofoam cup. She used to feel proud walking these halls. Now every step felt like walking on eggshells placed atop a minefield. The irony, she could have fixed it, quietly, without a scene. One phone call, a 5-minute explanation, and a side agreement to smooth things over. But that would have meant stepping back into Chase's spotlight. And if there's one thing ego hates, it's a reminder of competence in a language it doesn't speak. A week later, she found herself in a feedback session with one of Chase's HR imports, someone named Natalie who wore a nameplate necklace and always referred to problems as growth moments. Some of the younger staff feel stifled, Natalie said with a too bright smile. They sense judgment when they ask basic questions. Karen blinked slowly. Do you mean questions like what is an NDA? Natalie giggled. Exactly, Karen smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. She wanted to scream, to drag out old project folders and show them what it meant to build something, to remind them who found the bug that almost derailed the IPO, who negotiated through a trademark dispute while running payroll manually because the system had crashed, who stayed up 72 hours during the first merger so Chase could go to Coachella. But she didn't. Instead, she went home that night, poured herself a glass of the cheap red the founder always kept stocked for emergencies, and stared at a photo pinned to her fridge, the team's first year, all smiles and mismatched chairs. Chase in the background, half drunk and 19, flipping off the camera. She traced the edges of the image, then opened her desk drawer and pulled out the envelope she hadn't opened since the founder's funeral. She didn't break the seal. Not yet, because a part of her still hoped it wouldn't come to that they'd come to their senses. That someone, anyone, would realize that knowing the company's history wasn't a liability. It was the only reason it hadn't collapsed already. He didn't even look up from his phone when she walked in. Close the door, Chase said, thumb still scrolling like he was half invested in whatever influencer wisdom was guiding his day. When he finally did glance up, his expression wasn't angry or annoyed, it was bored. A rich kid's version of mercy. The kind you show an old dog you're tired of feeding. Let's not drag this out, he said, sliding a crisp manila folder across the table like it was an end-of-season clearance item. You've been a consistent presence, but we're moving in a different direction. More scalable, more aligned with our growth model. Karen didn't reach for the folder, didn't blink. He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach like he'd seen CEOs do in Netflix docudramas. Look, I know you were close with my dad, but your version of the company, it's not what we need anymore. Frankly, he paused like he'd practiced the line in the mirror. Your loyalty is a liability. There it was. She waited to feel something. Rage, humiliation, panic. But instead, it hit her like someone had unplugged a machine she didn't know had been running for years. Just silence, deep and strangely freeing. Karen nodded once. Okay, Chase blinked. That wasn't the reaction he'd rehearsed for. No tears, no bargaining, no storming out with righteous indignation. Just okay, she stood slowly. Took the manila folder, didn't thank him, he didn't deserve it. Outside the office, the air felt different. Thinner, like the building itself had shifted its alignment and no longer recognized her scent. She walked to her desk, head high, opened the drawer she hadn't touched since the founder's funeral. A black notebook. A key taped to the back. She pocketed both. The whispers started immediately. Someone from sales muttered, "Whoa, she's really out?" Someone else, probably Zach or Zeke, snorted. Guess the legacy chapter's closed. Karen didn't respond, didn't look at anyone. She packed methodically, like someone folding the flag at a funeral. Every item had weight. The mug with the chipped handle from the first vendor visit, the lint roller from the time she slept under her desk during rollout week. A thumb drive labeled M audit use if really needed. Then her phone pinged. One new email, no subject line. Sender, M, timestamped 6 weeks ago. Her breath hitched, she opened it. Karen, if you're reading this, they've forgotten what we built. Go to the all hands, place the Polaroid and the envelope on the podium. Trust me, M, her hand tightened around the mouse. She read it again. And again. Hadn't heard from him in months before he passed. Not since the hospital visits got too hard. Not since he'd whispered, "You'll know when it's time." And now here it was. Not a eulogy, not a goodbye, a directive. She reached into the bottom of her bag and pulled out the envelope. Still sealed. Still marked with his handwriting, for the right moment. And the Polaroid, yellowed, curled at the corners. 5 young faces under a tarp on a porch in Lake Norma. One of them was Chase. Barely 19, glassy-eyed and smiling like someone who didn't yet know how power could rot a person from the inside out. Her fingers shook, but not from fear. She didn't know what was in the envelope. She didn't need to, because the founder hadn't been sentimental. He'd been precise. Ruthless when necessary. He didn't leave breadcrumbs. He left fuses. Karen slid the envelope and the photo into the front pocket of her coat. She looked around her desk one last time, then paused and smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cruel. It was the smile of someone who just remembered that the foundation was poured long before the wallpaper, and she was holding the blueprint. The box lived under her bed, wedged between a suitcase with a broken wheel and a blanket she hadn't unfolded since the second merger. Karen had slid it there years ago, after the first real wave of change rolled through the company. Consultants in power blazers began replacing engineers who knew how to solder their own hardware. It was the kind of box you only open when the house is on fire, or when a dead man sends you instructions from beyond the grave. She had to dig for the key. Top drawer, old makeup bag, tucked beneath a travel-sized deodorant that had expired 2 Christmases ago. When she finally clicked the lock open, it sounded louder than it should have, like something breathing in a sealed tomb. Inside, history. A worn manila folder with the original office lease, signed in Sharpie because the founder hated ballpoints. A stack of onboarding documents from when they didn't even have HR. Napkin sketches. Meeting notes written in her looping, half-legible handwriting. She found an envelope labeled "Do Not Shred," stuffed with signed contracts from early hires, many of whom were long gone. Names now removed from every official version of the company timeline. Then she saw it. Nestled between 2 cracked USB sticks and a folded hoodie badge, the Polaroid. It was warped from time. Slightly sticky from a long-forgotten coffee spill, but the image was intact. Lake Norma, July 2014. The founder had rented the place from an old army buddy, cheap, ugly, and private, he'd promised. Karen remembered the cabin was half mildewed and reeked of gasoline and wet wood. They'd grilled meat on a rusted fire pit and ran through 3 bottles of bourbon trying to come up with the company's first operating principles. The idea wasn't to be perfect, it was to be honest. Write down what you'll protect, even when it's inconvenient, the founder had said. Sign it like a contract. If you can't stand by it drunk, don't pretend you'll honor it sober. And they did, one by one. Each exec, her included, scribbled their own lines on a printer paper. No legalese, just promises. Karen had written, "I will never let the mission outgrow the people who built it." Even Chase, baby-faced and sunburned, had scrawled something barely legible and signed it. He'd insisted on being part of it even though he was just visiting on break from college. The founder had raised an eyebrow, but let him in. He snapped the photo himself, wobbly-handed and laughing. "Proof of our stupidity," he joked. Only now it wasn't a joke, not anymore. Karen reached further into the box, past the old pitch decks and stock certificates, until her hand brushed something stiff and sealed, the envelope. Same one she kept after the funeral. Same envelope with "For the right moment" in the founder's all-caps scrawl. The seal hadn't been tampered with. The weight of it in her hand felt heavier than logic could explain. She didn't open it. Instead, she walked to her kitchen, poured a glass of water, sat at her tiny dining table, and stared at the 2 objects in front of her. The past, and whatever time bomb had been quietly ticking inside that paper shell. She thought about calling Ron, about texting someone in legal, about scanning the photo, emailing it anonymously to Richard, the lead investor, with a polite "You might want to look into this." But that wasn't the instruction. Place the Polaroid and the envelope on the podium. Not fax it, not forward it. Place, so she would. No spin, no theatrics, just trust, just like the founder asked. Karen carefully wiped down the Polaroid with a microfiber cloth and slid it into a hard shell case, the kind she used to store backup drives before the cloud made everyone lazy. She tucked the sealed envelope into her laptop bag alongside it. Then, she repacked the manila folder of old contracts, the napkin notes, and the hoodie badge. Just in case. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't about her hurt, or her demotion, or even the insult of being erased. It was about something much bigger that she'd carried quietly for over a decade. The map of where the bodies were buried. And tomorrow, she'd let the investors dig. All hands was held in the new multi-use event space Chase had commissioned last quarter, complete with velvet ropes, a branded step and repeat, and a stage lit like a tech conference hosted by a DJ. Rows of ergonomic chairs faced a giant screen pulsing with the company logo in animated gradients. A barista stand in the corner served branded lattes dusted with cinnamon logos. Someone even ordered a ring light for press photos. Karen entered through the side door. No badge check. No questions. She still knew the vendor routes, the loading dock schedules, the way event staff looked the other way if you moved like you belonged. She wore black slacks, a dark blouse, and her original company lanyard, yellowed and faded, with a photo of her 20 pounds lighter and 20 years more naive. No one expected her. Chase was already on stage, pacing like he was warming up for techs on vision execution at scale. His hair gleamed under the spotlight, every gesture rehearsed, every phrase baked in branding. Transformational synergy, growth lanes, legacy reboot. She didn't look at him. Her eyes scanned the front of the stage where the investor table sat. Richard was there, gray hair, sharper suit than usual, hands folded like a bored chess master. Two other board members sat beside him, scrolling intermittently through their phones and nodding at whatever jargon Chase was currently spraying into the room. Karen moved without hurry. A few execs saw her, familiar faces that twitched in recognition, like déjà vu wrapped in anxiety. One leaned over to the other, whispering. Another blinked and mouthed something that might have been as that. She reached the side podium table, stage left, where the mic stands were stacked and backup water bottles lived. Chase didn't even notice her. He was launching into a slide titled The Next Frontier, grinning like he'd just announced a rocket launch. Karen set down the envelope. Then, beside it, the Polaroid gently, like it might break under too much weight. The lights from the stage caught the glossy film just enough to make the image visible from a distance. 5 sunburned faces under a tarp, squinting into history. Chase was front and center, glassy-eyed, shirt half-buttoned, piece of paper in his hand. Richard noticed. He leaned forward, elbows to knees. Karen didn't speak, didn't move, just nodded once at him, slow and deliberate. Richard tapped the arm of the board member beside him and pointed. The other man squinted at the envelope. His posture changed, subtly, but enough. Chase was clicking to his next slide. As we enter Phase 4, we're not just evolving our platform, we're redefining the narrative of what success means. Richard raised his hand. Chase paused mid-slide. Is there a question? Chase asked, still smiling. Richard didn't answer him, he just pointed toward the podium table. Who placed that? Chase turned, squinting. Karen took one step back into the shadows. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. Chase stared at the Polaroid for a moment, then at the envelope, then at the faces of his investors, which were no longer nodding or smiling or scrolling. Room didn't erupt. No gasps, no sudden shouts, just stillness. A moment stretched taut across time, like a wire waiting to snap. And in that stillness, Karen felt something strange. Not fear, not revenge, but gravity. A sensation that something real, something heavy, was about to come crashing down. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel erased. She felt necessary. Richard didn't reach for it right away. For a moment, just stared at the envelope like it was hissing. Then, without a word, he stood slowly, like a man preparing for a storm he hadn't packed for, and walked across the front of the room toward the side podium. Chase kept talking, a multi-channel activation strategy that blends user-led innovation with predictive scalability. Richard picked up the envelope, held it between his fingers like it might be warm. The Polaroid sat beside it, almost humming with the weight of memory. He looked at it longer than he probably meant to, his brow furrowed just slightly. Then he cracked the seal. The sound was quiet, but it echoed like a fire alarm in Karen's ears. Inside was a single sheet, no folder, no appendix, no grand dossier, just a short, handwritten note. Richard read it once, then again, then slowly folded it shut and set it down. The room hadn't caught on yet. Chase was still rolling, bouncing on the balls of his feet as his slide deck transitioned to a 3D rendering of some hypothetical community integration space with social impact pods. Then Richard raised his hand. Flat, firm, it cut through the air like a blade. Where was this taken? The question hung. Chase blinked, caught mid-breath like someone had just unplugged his presentation. Sorry, Richard turned the Polaroid toward the room, held it up. Karen stepped into the light. Cabin off Lake Norma, she said, her voice steady. Clear, no microphone needed. July 2014. She turned slightly toward Chase. Ask him what he signed. A murmur started at the back of the room. One exec looked at another, confused. A junior product manager turned to his VP, whispering. Chase's jaw worked, but no sound came out at first. Then, that photo's old. It's from a trip. Just a team retreat. It's not, Richard interrupted. I'm asking what you signed. Chase let out a breath that was supposed to sound like a laugh, but landed closer to a cough. I was 19. My dad was. He always did these dramatic bonding things. He had everyone write down personal codes or whatever. It wasn't official. It was symbolic. Richard stepped closer. His voice was cool now. You were photographed holding a signed document. That photo was time-stamped. The founder initialed the back. Chase's eyes darted to the screen behind him, as if hoping it might start buffering and rescue him from the present. It was just a gesture. Karen watched it unfold like a slow detonation. She said nothing more. She didn't need to, because now Richard was holding both the envelope and the Polaroid, and he looked like someone who had just glimpsed a cliff edge he hadn't known was beneath his feet. The note, Richard said, references a clause, one that may pertain to founder succession and board voting thresholds. Chase blanched. That's absurd. It was a lake house. There was no legal anything. I mean, hell, Karen was just the ops lead then. He said it like ops was a swear word. Karen didn't flinch. Richard turned to her. Were you present? I witnessed every signature, she replied. I also have the scans, time-stamped. Stored offline. Originals are in a safety deposit box. Chase's composure began to fracture in microscopic cracks, eyes darting, tongue flicking against dry lips. The tight pull of his collar like it was suddenly a noose. Look, this is a sideshow. It's irrelevant. We're in Q4, this isn't the time for nostalgia games. Richard didn't move. Then you shouldn't be nervous. Chase tried to smile. Failed. The boardroom, once so loud with jargon and applause, fell into a hush so complete it felt like static pressure. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. The man on stage, the prince, the visionary, the rebrander of legacies, was suddenly speaking with a stutter. And the woman he called obsolete, she hadn't raised her voice once. But now, she was the only one in the room with both memory and proof. The board convened in a side room within minutes, glass walls drawn with blackout panels. Chase hustled in by two advisors, whispering frantically into his ears. His swagger had collapsed into speed-walking panic. The kind where you know the floor's cracking, but you're still pretending you can fix it with tone. Karen stayed in the main hall. She didn't pace, didn't eavesdrop. She just stood near the podium, where her presence now felt less like a protest and more like gravity reclaiming a planet that had spun too far off course. Within 10 minutes, Richard stepped out. He held the founder's note, now laminated in protective film by someone with a very nervous assistant. In his other hand was a copy of the company's early founder charter, retrieved from digital archives so dusty they still used TIFFs. Richard addressed the room, but his eyes never left Chase. The document in the Polaroid, he said, voice neutral but scalpel sharp, was not just symbolic. It predates Mr. Chase Mayer's formal employment, yes, but it was notarized, time-stamped, filed by the founder under provisional governance documents stored offline. Karen already knew this. She had filed the originals herself. Richard continued. That signed document stipulated that Mr. Mayer's voting rights and succession to majority control would be contingent upon 3 conditions. All 3 had to be met for full authority to transfer. Chase spoke up, voice cracking. I've been CEO for nearly a year. I've signed deals, moved teams, structured operations. That's not in question, Richard cut in. You've acted as CEO, but the clause pertains to legal inheritance of controlling interest. The air shifted, again. Condition 1, Richard continued, was successful fundraising within a 12-month runway. That was met. Condition 2, maintenance of profitability thresholds, arguably met, depending on audit outcomes. He paused for effect, then looked at Karen. Condition 3, retention of legacy leadership for no fewer than 12 months post-transition. Karen held his gaze. I was fired at month 9, she said. Richard nodded, then held up the note again. The founder anticipated this. His note, which we've now had verified as authentic, reads as follows. If my son fails to honor the time-tested backbone of this company, he forfeits the right to control it. Loyalty is not a liability, it's a requirement. Chase took a step forward. This is absurd. That's not binding. It wasn't even reviewed by counsel. Karen finally spoke, calm and devastating. You know who witnessed that clause? Me. Tina, the original CFO, your father's attorney, Ralph Kessler, and you? She pointed at the Polaroid. You're holding the signed sheet in your hand, grinning, because you thought it was a joke. Someone in the room let out a low breath, like a balloon slowly deflating. Richard turned to the remaining board members. Given that Condition 3 was violated, we must review the transfer of control under Clause 7.3 of the Provisional Founders Agreement. This isn't symbolic, it's procedural. Effective immediately, executive power will revert to the board until a legal determination is finalized. Chase froze. He didn't shout, didn't argue, because somewhere in that overly moisturized brain of his, the reality was setting in. Been handed a throne, and he'd kicked out the one person whose presence was keeping it from collapsing. Karen didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just turned slowly and began packing her laptop bag, not because she was leaving, but because she was finally done waiting. Justice, she realized, didn't always feel explosive. Sometimes it just felt like clarity, like fresh air, and Chase. He looked like a man who'd finally read the fine print, too late. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Per the terms of this clause, he said, holding the founder's note and the now digitized copy of the succession agreement side by side, control reverts to the board pending full legal review. Effective immediately. The words hit like thunder in a vacuum. No echo, no reaction at first, just silence so thick you could hear the fan blades above the stage stutter as they slowed. Chase blinked like the light had changed, and he didn't know whether to break or floor it. You're misreading this, he said, stepping forward. That was never formally filed. It wasn't part of the transition documentation. I had counsel review everything. You don't have. Karen reached into her bag. She didn't speak. She didn't look rushed. She just pulled out a leather folder and flipped it open with the kind of ease that says, "Been waiting for this exact moment for 9 months and 22 days. Inside, a clean, full-color scan of the original founder succession document. Notarized, time-stamped. Witnessed by 4 people, their names legible, their signatures matching archived HR records. Attached to it, a copy of the Polaroid, with Chase in the bottom right corner, holding up the signed sheet like he'd just won a beer pong tournament. She handed it to Richard without a word, skimmed it, then passed it to the board members flanking him. Chase's voice lifted an octave. This is insane. You're telling me some legacy employee, no offense, he added without irony, can override an entire year of executive decision-making because of some cabin bonding ritual. One of the board members, Lucinda, sharp as a guillotine, spoke for the first time. This wasn't a ritual, she said, flipping to the timestamp on the PDF. This was a binding supplement. You violated it. Chase's eyes darted across the room, looking for someone, anyone, to defend him. But the walls had started closing in, and the only person who'd once stood between him and disaster was now standing still. Watching. Not with smugness, not with fury, just calm, like the storm had passed and she was only here to log the damage. Richard cleared his throat. Board will now enter emergency session. Chase, you'll need to step outside. I am the board. Chase shouted. You were, Lucinda said without blinking. Security wasn't called. They didn't need to be. 2 internal council reps rose, quietly, firmly, and walked to Chase's side. One gestured toward the side exit. Chase hesitated, chest heaving, then looked to Karen as if to say, you wouldn't really let this happen, would you? She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't rescue him. As he passed her on the way out, steps halting and too loud in the otherwise frozen room, Karen looked up just once. Chase tried to meet her gaze. He couldn't. His eyes dropped to the floor, then the door, and then he was gone. The room exhaled. Richard turned to Karen, his tone softer now. Thank you for preserving this. She nodded once. No speeches. No declarations. She didn't need to be reinstated. Didn't want an apology. Her point had already been made and documented. Loyalty had never been about comfort or legacy. It was about truth, and the truth had just walked itself out of the building, wearing Italian loafers in shame. Karen gathered her things without a sound. Laptop, folder, old lanyard. She left through the main door this time, no more side entrances. As she stepped into the hallway, the light outside the boardroom cast a long shadow across the tile. And there he was, Chase, leaning against the wall like a man trying to catch breath that wouldn't come. He looked at her finally, but her eyes didn't linger. She just walked past him, calm, whole, done. And as the door shut behind her, Chase was left standing in the corridor with nothing in his hands but a memory of a moment he never took seriously, and the woman who never let go of it. Thanks for joining the fun, you office survivors. Subscribe for more switch-flicking drama. Let's make your former coworkers sweat.